All right, our next speaker is Jacob Prince. He'll be telling us about neural and computational evidence that category selective visual regions are facets of a unified object space.
Thanks, Talia. Along the ventral visual stream, we have a mosaic of selective regions for categories such as faces, bodies, and scenes. Nick told us about these earlier in the session. These regions are often studied separately and thought to have features that are specialized for their preferred domains and distinct functional roles in perceptual processing, with strong supporting evidence for these theories coming from both lesion studies and microstimulation data. But these regions do contain information about objects from other domains, and we don't have a selective region for each category of objects we can recognize. So are these areas entirely independent of one another, or might they be meaningfully interrelated? In this talk, I'll address the question empirically, making use of the newly released natural scenes dataset, and theoretically, by probing the tuning of deep neural network models and mapping them onto brain responses. The natural scenes dataset is part of a new era of massive condition-rich designs that go beyond studying just a few targeted categories, and instead model brain responses to a diverse set of individual images at scale. In NSD, subjects viewed thousands of natural scenes from the COCO dataset while being scanned at high resolution. And here we'll make use of NSD to explore tuning across category selective regions at a larger scale than most previous studies. We'll focus on a set of 515 images that overlapped across the subjects, which is only a small fraction of the data. And here are some of these images. Just for the sake of visualization, I've grouped them using their COCO category labels, but the labels don't enter into our analysis stream. For our sake, each image is its own condition. So how do the category selective regions respond to this large, diverse set of natural images? We can start by looking at univariate response profiles, looking in 4 different category selective regions for faces, scenes, bodies, and words. We find graded univariate response profiles across the 515 images. Importantly, these profiles are highly reliable across subjects, though slightly less so in VWFA. And we also find graded interrelationships between the regions. For example, FFA and EBA are related, and perhaps unsurprisingly, FFA and PPA are negatively correlated. The structure is apparent when we visualize the full set of pairwise similarities between the regions. And so overall, we see distinctive, reliable response profiles using this rich set of stimuli. And this makes sense given that the regions were defined based on their separate selectivities. But what about the multivariate relationships between these regions? We looked at the similarity structure among these 515 images across the voxels in each ROI as a way to characterize the representational geometry of each region. Here are the representational similarity matrices. Again, these are highly reliable. And as you might be able to tell by eye, they seem to share quite a bit of structure. This is not only true for FFA and EBA, but also for FFA and PPA, which surprisingly show weaker but still positive correlations in their geometries. In visualizing the pairwise similarity between all the regions, we see reliable related geometries across the board, with PPA having a slightly weaker relationship to the others. And these regional geometries were also similar to that of the larger scale occipitotemporal cortex sector. Importantly, these similarity levels can't be due to noise correlations in the data, since we're always comparing RDMs across completely independent splits of subjects. These results on the whole suggest a deeper relationship between these ROIs and between each ROI and the surrounding cortex. So how can we make sense of this theoretical perspective? Recently, Bao and colleagues suggested one idea for how these regions might interrelate, proposing a unified picture of IT organization in which category selective regions are part of a coarse map of object space whose dimensions can be extracted from a deep neural network. So based on this theoretical proposal, we next asked whether we can identify category selective units in deep neural networks trained on object recognition. To try and localize these units, we followed standard procedures from fMRI, first showing images of faces, bodies, scenes, objects, and words to a network trained on ImageNet. And then we recorded responses in each unit of the model and applied a statistical contrast to identify units that were selected for each domain. And we found that we were able to identify relatively small subsets of units that had learned selectivities for these domains across the network, even emergent within the same layer. And here we're showing layer FC6 as an example. This held with an alternate localizer set. And the fact that we can identify these units in the first place is consistent with the idea that category selectivity can emerge in a unified representational space for objects. So how can we go about linking these selective parts of models and brains? To link the selective subsets of the model to their corresponding selective regions in the brain, we used a voxelized encoding model, but with some new constraints that depart from traditional methods. So take, for example, this voxel from FFA. We're going to model it as a positive weighted combination of face selective units only from the layer. In this way, only units that respond strongly to faces in the model can be used to predict voxels that respond strongly to faces in the brain. And interestingly, this is not a standard assumption. The typical approach is to use weighted combinations of all the features in the layer to explain each single voxel with both positive and negative weighting allowed. That's a pretty flexible mapping procedure. Our approach instead tries to preserve a meaningful relationship between the selectivities of brain and model. So given these particular linking assumptions, we can now ask, how well do these category selective subsets account for the univariate and multivariate response signatures we see in the brain at scale using pretty much the biggest data set we could get our hands on? First, considering the univariate response profiles. Here's data from an example subject showing the 4 regions, and here are the predicted response profiles derived from our encoding procedure. We can correlate the brain and model, repeat this procedure for 8 subjects, and summarize the prediction levels here, where each dot is a subject. The colored dots are selective subsets from our object-trained model, and the gray dots are subsets defined in the same way from an untrained model. We find moderate prediction levels overall, definitely above 0, but certainly with room to go to reach the noise ceiling, especially in VWFA, which makes that region particularly interesting to think about in relation to the rest of the selective areas. We also find that the trained model subsets do far better than untrained model subsets. And we also tried using selective units for one category to predict brain regions that had different preferences. And in all cases, we found that the regions were best predicted by the subsets with matching selectivities. And this held only because of our positive weighting constraint in the encoding model. So the selective subsets do seem to capture something about the graded representational structure that we see in these regions. Now we can repeat the same analysis, this time looking at multivariate RDMs. Here are the data we saw earlier with a surprising degree of shared structure in the geometries. And here are the predictions from the encoding procedure. And right away, we can see that these selective subsets also provide RDMs that have some amount of shared structure despite their distinct selectivities. Here are group summaries of our prediction levels. And again, we see moderate prediction levels overall. This is a really large scale comparison. The RDM has over 132,000 pairwise comparisons. So it's a very strong test of correspondence for these small groups of units in a single layer. Again, prediction levels are far better than those from untrained models. And for FFA, we've also compared these RDMs against those derived from a model trained on face identification using VGG face, finding that the face trained model actually does worse at explaining data from FFA. So the selective unit subsets are also able to capture multivariate representational signatures we see in the brain data. These last sets of results looked at how these selective subsets from the model map onto brain regions with corresponding selectivities. But we can also look at whether the selective subsets account for how brain regions interrelate to one another, which are the results I plotted at the start of the talk. And we can see that the regional relationships we found in the brain also emerge when we compare the predicted responses from the model subsets. So what do these patterns of data tell us? On one hand, there's room to go for sure to reach the noise ceiling in all cases. This is definitely not a perfect model. But on the other hand, what we've shown here is that in a single layer of a single model, we can pre-identify selective subsets of units using an independent localizer procedure that explain both univariate and multivariate signatures of really distinct regions that are traditionally thought of and modeled separately. And just like the brain has some regions with category selectivity, as we've shown here, so does the model. And the proposal of a unified object space in occipitotemporal cortex provides a framework for thinking about how these category selective regions relate to one another and to the broader representational space for objects. Broadly, this work takes new strides in thinking about how to more meaningfully understand how these powerful predictive vision models map onto occipitotemporal cortex. Thank you.
Some time for questions.
Yeah, they're really interesting. Sorry, I lost my voice. So I agree with you that the results from the visual word familiar are like super interesting. So can you speculate a little bit about what's going on there?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, so the univariate prediction levels were much lower. There are a number of things that could be going on. On one side, there could be an issue with the model and with the training diet. It could be the case that ImageNet doesn't have sufficient word or letter-related content to really give rich enough features that can account for the structure in VWFA. It could also be the case that the set of brain responses we have from the COCO data set don't meaningfully span the space of VWFA responses well enough. Or it even could be the case that we just are qualitatively completely missing the mark with our model, and that you need to build in some other kind of structure in order to account for the really specialized kinds of computations that are happening in VWFA.
Thank you.
Hey, Jacob, really nice work. So I'm really curious what's driving the correlations between like FFA and PPA. So they're clearly not doing the same thing. And I'm wondering whether you've tested what the preferred categories in each. So if you just pulled out the faces from FFA or just seen PPA and looked at those similarities, would those still be correlated? And if not, which I predicted wouldn't, is it really driven by some low level similarity in the non-preferred categories that, you know, the categories that those regions don't care about?
Mhm. Thanks, Vlad. It's a really interesting question. It's something we've looked at not super extensively, but the correlations do persist, though weaker, when looking only at exemplars from the preferred categories. And I think it would be very interesting to kind of systematically study the degree to which these interrelationships change when you look only at images within the preferred, between the non-preferred. Definitely close to the top of the agenda for next analyses for the paper.
Great, thanks.
As someone who studies V1 and objects as well, I don't think you should be surprised that those confusion matrices are similar. So if you look at a V1 model or the early layer of AlexNet, you're going to find the correlations is going to correlate with the PPA and FFA confusion matrices. More of a comment than a question. Have you tried looking at an intermediate layer of AlexNet? So let's say FFA is more like a mid-level processing rather than fully connected layer, and how that fits?
Mm-hmm. Great question. The prediction levels that I showed here are broadly consistent across most of the high layers in the model. Looking at mid to high layers in the fifth convolutional block, they're slightly lower in general.